So we're on chapter 24 of your U.S. history book on the Great Depression. The Great Depression happened between October of 1929, October 29 when the stock market crashed, to 1939 or 1940. And so during this time, we have two presidents. We're going to be going over President Herbert Hoover. He was the 31st president, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR. That's what I'll be calling him, FDR, so you don't get him mixed up with Teddy Roosevelt, although he was a relative of Teddy Roosevelt, a cousin. And President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive, and will prosper." So you can see some of these pictures from the Great Depression here. The lines, here's a rescue society here for the homeless. So you see the homeless lined up there. The Great Depression, people, especially men, trying to find work, families, and how the stocks shrunk $10 billion on the stock market crash. These things caused the Great Depression. So let's go ahead, let's begin. Herbert Hoover's administration. Again, he was the 31st president. In 1929, there was unprecedented prosperity in the United States. Remember the end of the Roaring 20s, and people were making money and they were buying things on credit, you know, when it, basically the stock market on credit too. In the midst of this, in 1929, the stock market crashes on October 29, 1929. And so the Great Depression started when Herbert Hoover was president. When he became president, he had no inkling that this would happen at all. So the Great Depression began between 1929 and 1940. And President Hoover tried to fight the Great Depression, but the end of his term was worse than it was ever. And so basically everyone was looking at the president, of course, to get them out of this depression. And it didn't seem like he was doing the job. So of course, even though he'd run for president again, he would lose. So, but Herbert Hoover, Hoover had served the administrations of both the Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge before. They were both Republican. And he shared many of their ideas about the proper relationship among government, business, and the people. So it had been a Republican, and it was a prosperous time. In short, he favored federal government that played as little role as possible in the affairs of business. So he basically, his whole was a laissez-faire that basically government would stay out of business. So, and as the next era came in, you'll see just the opposite. So here's some pictures of Herbert Hoover as president. And here's his, I like this picture here. It says Business Boulevard, Detour, Speculation Street. So basically he would have to take a detour in the midst of a Great Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR. He promised a New Deal. He won the election of 1932 against Herbert Hoover, and the New Deal was intended to encourage prosperity. But actually, it did little to restore the nation, as we'll find out, although the government got so involved in the midst that it almost looked like a socialist type environment in the United States. Dangerous precedents were set for government intervention in the nation's economy during the FDR time as president, the New Deal, as he called it. And the economy only recovered after World War II, later on, after Roosevelt actually died at the end of his fourth term. And when I say fourth term, he's the only president to serve over 2 terms. So he went into the 4th term and died during the World War II in 1945. And we'll get into that later. So here we have some pictures here. Roosevelt promises national relief here. You see his promises, quick action, to be put to Congress. FDR's New Deal to bring recovery out of the Great Depression. That was his New Deal. And he had all these, FDR and the New Deals, you see all these children dancing around. He started so many, so many, I should say, associations and so many works in dealing with the people, so many committees, and we'll get into all of that. The New Deal, and here we have the years 1933 to 1937, and here's a picture of FDR. So let's go back to the election of 1928. We have Republican Herbert Hoover. In 1874, he lived 1874 to 1964, 90 years. He lived a long time. We're going to talk a little bit about him here. So he was the Secretary of Commerce under the Harding administration and the Coolidge administration, the past two presidents. And Herbert Hoover was considered a great humanitarian during World War I. Woodrow Wilson he was president during World War I, and he put together a food administration. And Herbert Hoover actually was in charge of the food administration that brought food to war-torn Europe. And so he did a lot. And he was considered a great humanitarian at that point. And he also was on the ticket of prosperity. As we say, when Herbert Hoover took office, the United States was prospering. He ran against the Democrat, Al Smith. Al Smith was the governor of New York. And Al Smith advocated the repeal of the 18th Amendment. So what's the 18th Amendment? It was the prohibition of alcohol at that time. So he wanted to repeal, or I should say appeal, the 18th Amendment in that point, and bring back alcohol, as it was prohibited and the bars were closed down. So, of course, he was governor of New York and doing that. He was the first Roman Catholic ever running for president. So that's kind of a test question. The first Roman Catholic to run for president was Al Smith. And he was running against Herbert Hoover. So, of course, there was a landslide victory for Hoover. Hoover won 6 million popular votes and 444 electoral votes to only 87 electoral votes with Al Smith. And so the Republicans now controlled both houses. And so even some of the Democrats voted for Herbert Hoover, knowing that he was a great humanitarian we'll tell a little bit about his life, but he actually was an orphan, self-made man. We'll find out some more about him in a little bit. So here was the election of 1928. Herbert Hoover was Republican, wins against Al Smith, and he was on the European Relief Council here. Here is the landslide. You can see all of the red Republican here, and the Democrat votes were very much centered in the South here. So actually too, everyone wanted President Calvin Coolidge was president at this time, and he decided and declined to run for president again. And so that brought Herbert Hoover in. And of course, people liked him, considering he was a good man. Herbert Hoover's qualifications. So he was a self-made man. He was orphaned at the age of 9 years old. He was born of a Quaker family in Iowa. And then he moved to Oregon with an uncle. And his uncle was a mining engineer, and he worked in mining for a while. And then he supported himself to go through college. Can you imagine the college that he went to was Stanford University in California? Nowadays, you can't get into Stanford unless you have lots of money. But he worked as a mining engineer, and then he went to Stanford University. He married his college sweetheart, who also went to Stanford there. And they valued honesty, industrious life, simplicity. He was all that. He was I believe he was a Christian. At the age of 40, he was a business millionaire. Through what he did with the mining and his college and everything putting together, gradually he just made a lot of money and he became a business millionaire. And against direct intervention of the government in business and economy, he was totally against the government coming in and manipulating business and economy, like a governor coming in with socialism and communism and such. He was totally against that. Here's some pictures of him when he was younger. And here's some pictures, of course, for President Herbert Hoover. Here's his wife and his family there. You can see this is when he was orphaned as a young child here. So you see this picture. So Hoover was considered, like I said, the great humanitarian. He did a lot of work in China during the Boxer Rebellion. He was in China. I think it had to do with mining, but he also was considered a hero in China during the Boxer Rebellion. Was a great rebellion where they killed a lot of missionaries. The Chinese decided to get rid of anybody that was of Western. They wanted to get rid of all Western people out of the country. And so the Boxer Rebellion was considered that time of many innocent people dying during that time. But he was a hero and saved the lives of Chinese children's lives. Quite a few Chinese children, he saved their lives during the Boxer Rebellion. So he was considered a hero. In World War I, he was in charge of relief efforts and bringing in food for the starving Belgians. The Belgians during World War I were hit. Belgium was hit the hardest, and so during that time, he was bringing food to them. So of course, China, they loved him, and also and the missionaries loved him, and of course the Belgians loved him. He then took charge of President Woodrow Wilson's food administration during the war, and he supervised war efforts in Europe all throughout the war. And so they would call in Europe during when the military, not only America during World War I, but also European countries, such as, France and England and even Russia. He would bring in Hoover lunches. So the farming community in the United States would ship in food, and he put together lunches and bring them to all of the military of the Allies during World War I. So you can see how he was really loved, especially internationally. So, and he also made the Commerce Department an efficient part of government as he became head of Commerce Department during that time, during World War I. So you can see here some more pictures of him. He was on the European Relief Council. So Hooverizing, they called it Hooverizing. He paid when Woodrow Wilson placed Hoover in charge of the agricultural production for the American war effort. He was so successful that everybody said it was Hooverizing. He also was cutting back and on spending in this area, and was rationing. He was in charge of rationing in America, so rationing food and such people in America for the troops. So people would not, they would ration their food here so they could send food over for the American troops during World War I. And so Hooverizing was considered to be, he was considered to be an amazing humanitarian, amazing at what he did in this area. So when he ran for president, he was well known with a good reputation. And his vice president, Charles Curtis, was also well known. Not that he was, a vice president, very active as vice presidents weren't usually that active, but his name was Charles Curtis, and he was a member of the Kaw Nation in Kansas. So he was Native American, the first Native American vice president in American history. So he was very high ranking in Native American government. And here's pictures of him here, his Kaw Nation. So he was known for that. That's Hoover's vice president. Growing prosperity. Well, Hoover's inaugural address was heard on the radio. So at that time, now, instead of people sitting around watching TV, of course the television wasn't there then, they would sit around and listen to the radio. And Hoover spoke his address as president, inaugural address, on the radio for thousands of people to hear. And he had a bright hope for the future. At that time, good things were happening. Trade was flourishing, industry was expanding, wages were increases, corporations had good profits, the federal income taxes were decreasing, and Treasury had surpluses. America was doing well. But these roaring 20s would come to an end, and little did President Hoover know. So we have a picture of him again. This is Hoover home. Everything was going good. And when he won the election, prosperity he thought was underway. And he won by an overwhelming victory. So, but the causes of the Great Depression. So people are thinking, what caused the Great Depression and why would this happen in 1930? Remember, we're talking about he's president in 1929 here, and just a year after, less than a year of being president, the economy falls apart. So, and now economists look back at this time and say, what caused this? So, number one, they say easy credit. So interest rates were kept very low by the Federal Reserve. Listen, the Federal Reserve was kind of controlling. Remember, Federal Reserve was the banking system of the government. And it was actually not totally controlled by the government in that, but some very wealthy men, including J.P. Morgan and quite a few, and they were actually manipulating, the economy by keeping the interest rates low. And this caused business and individuals to take out loans very easily. So you go get a loan for a house and you didn't have to pay much interest. So people were getting lots of loans during this time. And that was producing easy credit. Another thing that was happening was installment plans. Now, you don't know much about installment plans, but I do. And growing up, that you could even buy clothes. If you wanted to buy something, you couldn't afford it. You could put it on layaway or hold, or sometimes even take it home and then end up paying for it later by payments. Installment plans. Installment plans for cars and homes and even appliances. Like I said, even clothing, if you wanted to buy something, not even now, installment plans for even homes. So people were buying above what they could afford. The stock market in the New York Stock Exchange and Wall Street was booming then. And most of the stock was owned by shareholders. It wasn't by just a few businesses, but people were buying stocks. And they were actually buying stocks above what they could afford buying stocks too. So in 1920s, the stock dividends were soaring, and they'd buy stocks and they'd end up their stocks would be worth a lot more, and they were making money. And so many more people said, hey, you should get in the stock market. I just made, thousands of dollars or whatever. So people were just grabbing on to buy stocks, and the stocks were going up higher and higher every day. So what would happen, after they got so high? Well, risky investments or speculation to make a profit in gambling. So ignoring the value of the stocks, they would buy the stock as the stock would go up, and they'd sell at a higher price and get more money for it, right? And these speculators, it's kind of like gambling, but these speculators would buy and trade stocks far above their actual value. And that point, they would try to keep it going up until think, oh, and it's not going to go down, let's keep going up. But they'd also what's called buying on margin. Buying on margin, they'd buy stocks on credit. So they'd only pay 10% in cash, and then the rest they would borrow so that they could buy. That would be terrible, only 10% on cash. And then they would make enough money later to pay for the stock as the stock would go up. And so they called it buying on margin. But this was very risky. And these were all risky investments. But back then they thought, well, we can do that. Everything seems to be going really good. So here's some pictures here. It says, we're going to get into some other causes, but the stock market crash was definitely one. And then you'll go into other things like the high tariff and unequal distribution of wealth and all, just a few things here. And some of these things I'm not too sure about, but anyway, the stock market crash indeed was one of the causes of the Great Depression. Farmers were struggling. Another cause. Well, the farmers' plight started before the Great Depression. In World War I, farmers' surplus, they were basically, making lots of surpluses and shipping it in for the war. And the farmers their grain prices were rising because, of course, they were producing a lot of grain to actually feed the whole world. But after the war, the price of grain dropped, causing the surplus goods. So now they had a lot of surplus crops. And so the farmers then, with the prices dropping, they couldn't sell their products for as much money as they had before. In fact, that sometimes they couldn't even sell their products. They would take out loans, and this loans would cause them to go in debt. So the banks were desperate to fulfill the obligations on other clients. So the bank said, you need to pay out back your loan to the farmers. Well, they couldn't pay back their loan because their crops, the price of their crops were so low. And so the farmers were declaring bankruptcy because the banks were repossessing their land and taking their land and their property away during the Great Depression. So the banks were coming in and taking their land. As you can see here, here's a sale of a farm. They had to sell their farm because they couldn't pay their loans that they had taken out. Here's a couple that packed up their bags and left, farmers. Down here, they're eating. They're homeless right now, just sitting out and eat. Another thing that we found was during this time was a great dust storms were coming in that made things even worse. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. Just remember, 29. It's Black Tuesday. It was on a Tuesday. So first of all, on October 24th, 5 days before, there was a massive wave of selling stock and the prices went down. 13 million stock changed hands. 13 million stocks were changing hands. Everybody was trying to sell their stocks. JP Morgan and others tried to invest to quell the panic, but it actually made things worse. It stabilized for a few days to try to stop the panic, but it didn't. It only, like I said, it did not help. So on October 29, Black Tuesday, the bottom fell out of the stock market. 16 million more stocks exchanged hands in that day. 16 million. So we had how many? 13 million stocks, now 16 million more stocks exchanged hands. People were trying to get sell their stocks as fast as they can so that their stock is not going to fall down to zero. So in mid-November, $30 billion were lost in the New York Stock Exchange. $30 billion. And many investors lost everything, big and small. People were jumping out of windows and everything. They were just like, people were just, as they lost everything, they went from being wealthy to being poor in just one day. And being, having an expensive home to having nothing and being homeless in one day. This was called Black Tuesday. Wall Street crashed here. Here's a picture of it, and everyone, and you'll find out everyone here, and what they're doing is, first of all, they're running to exchange their stocks, but they're also going to be running to their banks, right? Bank failures. All credit was shut off due to bank runs. What's a bank run? They're running to their banks to get their money out, because now you know who else invested in the stock market? Banks. The banks were actually, as people put their savings in the banks took their savings and invested in the stock market. That's what they did back then. So the banks had little money in the bank itself, and everybody wanted to run and get their money out of the bank, thinking that the bank was going to close down, and they had their whole savings in the bank. And so they were running to get their money out before it was too late, and many banks had many of the banks were losing money as quick as the other people on the stock market. So the banks started failing by the scores, one bank after another. 4,000 banks closed their doors permanently and did not give the people back their money. And millions of Americans lost all their savings that they had in the bank. Can you imagine that? You can't get your money out of the bank, and you have all your savings and everything in there, and now you have nothing, no money at all, and your bank took it and closed down. It's terrible. There's some pictures of bank runs here. People running into these banks trying to get their money, and almost riots happening. Then unemployment. Hundreds of factories were unable to sell their products and such, and as the factories, during the Wall Street crash too, were affected. So their production started to cease, and they had to lay off a lot of their hundreds of workers were just laid off that day. The average rate fell in 1930s to 17%. So still, you need 17%. It's not huge, not everyone, but we got up to like 1/4 of people that were out of work. And so here's a picture. Please give my dad a job. I know 3 trades. I speak 3 languages. Fought for 3 years. I have 3 children and no work for 3 months. But I only want 1 job. And here's some pictures: labor, porter, they all painter. They all had trades and everything, but they couldn't get their jobs. So harsh time indeed. The Federal Reserve then tried to intervene, and this is not good. So I don't know if some people say the Federal Reserve actually caused this to happen. I'm not sure. That might be a conspiracy theory to some even today as they look back, because when the very wealthy try to manipulate the economy for their good, is that they end up making tons of money while everybody else loses money. We know that. But anyway, in fact, Milton Friedman says here, he's an economist, says the Federal Reserve, the privately owned U.S. central bank, definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933. So basically, they would make more money, causing inflation, and then they pull back the money, causing more problems with less money. So more money. So that was the Federal Reserve doing that. So the government intervention was the big reason for the severity of the Great Depression. It wouldn't have been so severe if the government had not been intervening. So the government interference in the free market would worsen things. The Federal Reserve system tried to keep interest rates down by encouraging loans at that point, then contracted the money supply, causing banks to close. They pulled the money back, causing the banks to close, and the result was a loss of money to Americans. And money in the banks were gone, and the Federal Reserve did just the opposite of its purpose. So the Federal Reserve getting involved caused the Depression to go harsher and deeper and affect more people. So here are some pictures. This is a unique picture. It says, there is no way like the American way, and they're all driving the car, world's highest standard of living, and boom, everybody's in line to get food. So, and here they want work here in front of the White House. So this one says, I voted for ham and eggs. I believe the banks. The success of private relief. Many Americans lost their jobs. College students were down to shining shoes for a living. Soup kitchens, bread lines, shelters for the homeless sprung up. The Salvation Army and the American Red Cross tried to meet the needs of the unemployed. Family, friends, neighbors, they all tried to help each other. Food and clothing drives were happening, and shelters, and people were even growing their own vegetable gardens. So during if you know people that have gone through the Great Depression, most of them are very old or probably have died by now. But you know that they're very tight on money, and that's the way they've lived. They canned their own produce. They had to live as meagerly as they could during this time. The Dust Bowl worsened things. The farmers in the Midwest, again, were hit the hardest. Many had gone through foreclosures, bankruptcies, and evictions. They were evicted from their houses, and the bank took over their farms. And the families had become destitute because there was no land. They had no land now for the crops. And this worsened in 1930 with a severe drought. And the Great Plains of Kansas and Oklahoma and down to Texas, in the Texas Panhandle, they would have these huge dust storms because the land basically was not growing crops. They would just blow the dirt and blow the sand, and mainly dirt. Let's just say that. The crops shriveled up with the burning heat because of the drought, and the soil swirled away with the wind, and the clouds of the dust blinded everyone, and the Dust Bowl caused many to head now west to California, to leave this area of the Midwest looking like this. See where the dust covered all of their farming equipment and everything. You could hardly breathe, so the Dust Bowl worsened things. Plus, they had a socialist propaganda going on in this time. So, of course, during any tragedy, communists and socialists try to take over and say, hey, we know how to fix everything. Just let us take over, right? That's what happens even now with communism and socialism. So the socialists magnified the crisis to move socialism and communism into America. And there were writers and there were artists and photographers. They would all exaggerate things if they were socialists. Especially the book came out called Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And John Steinbeck wrote this book about Oklahoma farmers leaving Oklahoma and really exaggerated it to the world to say, man, they're really doing bad. Well, things were bad, you could imagine, but not exaggerated bad, Rumors of the mortgage closures turned into mass evictions, and he pictured hunger riots, riots having exaggerated statistics and caused more fear. So that's what socialists and communists do, so they could take over. New World Order, right? In Russia, the communist propaganda made life seem better in Russia. And people thought, well, maybe we should become a communist state in America. The communists are doing better, but little do they know in reality that Russia was in a permanent depression state, and the Marxist socialism starved millions of people to death in Russia. In fact, 15 to 20 million people were actually killed and starved to death in Russia. So as Americans were looking into socialism or communism, they did not see exactly what was going on. In reality, Americans were way better off than Russians were during this time. So Hoover counters the Depression, and so to do this, he's trying to end up. You know what? I'm going over time, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and then I'll finish this in the next video.